He will never write you a love letter. He will never cry during a movie and tell you it reminded him of you. But he will do one specific thing that most people completely miss, and if you have ever seen it, you already know exactly what I am talking about. If you love an avoidant person, and you have ever wondered whether the quiet, guarded, careful way he treats you actually means something real, stay with me for the next few minutes because I am about to show you the one behavior that separates an avoidant who is simply passing through from an avoidant who has genuinely chosen you. By the end of this video, you will understand why this one specific thing matters more than any romantic gesture ever could, and why, if you are seeing it, you should think very carefully before ever letting this person go. Before we go further, comment the word keeper below if you have ever experienced this exact thing with an avoidant partner and did not fully understand what it meant at the time. That one word tells me you are paying attention, and it helps this video reach more people trying to understand the quiet language of avoidant love. Now here is something important. Comment the word keeper right now if any part of this sounds like your relationship. Type it exactly like that, just the one word, keeper. It takes 2 seconds and it keeps this information circulating to the people who genuinely need to hear it before it disappears into the feed. Let us slow down for a second and talk honestly about avoidant attachment, because most content online gets this completely wrong. Avoidant does not mean cold. It does not mean incapable of love. It means love filtered through fear. Love that learned early on to protect itself by staying quiet, staying guarded, staying at a careful distance. Somewhere in childhood, an avoidant person usually learned that emotional needs were inconvenient or overwhelming or simply unmet consistently enough that reaching out stopped feeling safe. So they built walls not because they did not want connection, but because connection once felt dangerous. And some part of them never fully unlearned that lesson. When an avoidant person finally does let someone in, it rarely looks like the big dramatic gestures movies taught us to expect. It looks smaller than that, quieter than that. And it is exactly why so many people miss it entirely, mistaking devotion for distance simply because it does not come wrapped in the packaging they were taught to look for. It helps to understand where this pattern actually comes from, because knowing the origin makes the behavior itself far easier to interpret correctly. Attachment researchers have spent decades studying how early relationships with caregivers shape the way people handle closeness later in life. A child whose emotional bids for comfort were met inconsistently, sometimes warmly received and sometimes ignored or dismissed, tends to learn a very specific lesson over time. That lesson is simple but powerful. Needing someone is unreliable. Depending on connection can lead to disappointment. The safest strategy, then, becomes self-reliance, emotional independence, and a quiet retreat the moment closeness starts to feel like too much exposure. This is not a conscious decision made in adulthood. It is a deeply ingrained survival strategy formed long before the person had any real say in the matter, which is exactly why it can feel so automatic, so involuntary, so difficult to override, even when the adult version of that person genuinely wants closeness with someone specific. Understanding this origin matters because it reframes everything you are about to hear in this video. The behavior we are about to break down is not simply a personality quirk or a random relationship habit. It is a person actively working against a deeply wired survival instinct, an instinct that formed for genuinely protective reasons long before you ever entered their life. When you see that instinct being overridden, even briefly, even imperfectly, you are witnessing something that required real internal effort to produce, not something that happened by accident or by default. Here is the one thing an avoidant does for you, the thing that means everything, even though it looks like almost nothing from the outside. He stays in the room during hard conversations instead of shutting down completely and disappearing. Let that sink in for a second, because on the surface it sounds so small it barely seems worth mentioning. But if you understand avoidant attachment even a little, you know exactly how enormous this actually is. The natural, deeply wired instinct of an avoidant person during emotional conflict is to leave. Not necessarily leave the relationship, though sometimes that too, but leave the moment itself. Shut down, go quiet. Physically walk out of the room. Change the subject so fast it gives you whiplash. Retreat into work, into a hobby, into anything that lets them escape the discomfort of sitting inside a hard emotional conversation with another person watching. So when an avoidant person stays, when they sit there uncomfortable, maybe fidgeting, maybe struggling to find the right words, but they do not leave. They do not shut the door. They do not go cold and silent for 3 days afterward. That staying is not nothing. That staying is one of the most significant things an avoidant person can offer anyone because it means they are actively fighting against their own deepest instinct for you in that exact moment. Think about what that actually requires internally. It requires him to sit with a level of discomfort that his entire nervous system has been trained since childhood to avoid. It requires him to tolerate the exposure of being fully seen, mid-conflict, mid-vulnerability, without the escape hatch he has relied on his entire life. This is not comfortable for him. This is not natural for him. And that is precisely the point. The effort it takes for an avoidant person to stay present during difficulty is not visible on the surface, but it is enormous underneath, and it only happens for people they have decided are actually worth that effort. Consider what is physically happening inside someone during a moment like this. For many avoidant people, emotional closeness under pressure triggers a genuine physiological stress response, not unlike what happens when facing a real threat. The heart rate picks up, the urge to physically move, to leave the room, to do literally anything other than remain still and present becomes almost overwhelming. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It reflects how deeply avoidance is wired into the nervous system for people who develop this pattern early in life. So when someone with that wiring chooses to stay anyway, chooses to sit through that internal alarm bell ringing at full volume rather than acting on it, they are doing something that takes genuine, measurable effort, even if none of that effort is visible from across the room. Contrast this with what happens in relationships where an avoidant person has not fully invested, where the connection still feels casual, uncertain, replaceable in their mind even if they have not said so out loud. In those situations, the instinct to leave during conflict wins almost every single time. The moment things get uncomfortable, they disappear, sometimes physically, sometimes just emotionally, going cold and distant until the discomfort passes on its own. There is no fighting against the instinct in those relationships because there is not yet enough invested to make that fight feel worthwhile to them. This distinction matters enormously because it means the presence or absence of staying can actually function as a kind of honest signal, one that is much harder to fake than words ever could be. Anyone can say, "I am committed to this relationship." Far fewer people, especially avoidant people, can consistently demonstrate that commitment through repeated uncomfortable acts of staying when every instinct points toward leaving instead. Words are cheap and easy to produce even when they are not entirely true, overriding a deep survival instinct again and again, specifically for one particular person, is not something that happens without real underlying investment behind it. So when you notice an avoidant staying, actually staying through an uncomfortable conversation, through your tears, through his own visible discomfort, recognize what you are actually witnessing. You are witnessing someone override years of self-protective conditioning in real time, specifically because leaving you did not feel like an option worth taking, even though every instinct in his body was probably screaming at him to run. If this is resonating with you right now, that is exactly why I want you to comment the word keeper below. It helps me know these breakdowns are actually landing, and it pushes this video toward more people trying to understand this exact quiet, complicated kind of love. Now let us talk about how this staying actually shows up, because it does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is as simple as him not walking out of the room when you bring up something that upsets you, even though his whole body language screams that he wants to. Sometimes it is him going quiet, clearly uncomfortable, clearly out of his depth, but still sitting there, still making eye contact even when it is hard, still eventually saying something, anything, rather than retreating into total silence. Sometimes it looks like him texting you an hour later, after initially shutting down, to say he is still thinking about what you said, even if he could not fully respond to it in the moment. That follow-up, that return after the initial instinct to disappear, is often just as meaningful as staying in the room in the first place, because it shows the retreat was temporary, not permanent, a pause rather than an exit. There are other smaller versions of the same behavior worth watching for too, because staying does not only apply to formal arguments or heavy relationship conversations, it shows up in smaller emotional moments as well. Does he stay present when you are venting about a hard day, even if he does not have the perfect words of comfort ready? Does he remain in the conversation when you bring up something vulnerable about your past, rather than quickly steering things toward a lighter, safer topic? Does he sit with you in silence during a genuinely sad moment, rather than immediately reaching for a joke or a distraction to diffuse the discomfort he is feeling? Each of these smaller instances is really the same core behavior, just in a lower stakes setting. And noticing how often it appears across different kinds of emotional moments gives you an even clearer picture of how consistently he is choosing presence over retreat. Pay attention also to how this staying evolves over time, because it usually does not appear fully formed right at the beginning of a relationship with an avoidant person. Early on, conflict often does trigger the full retreat, the silence, the distance, the days of coldness, before things slowly thaw back to normal. What you are looking for is the trajectory. Is he staying a little longer each time? Is the silence after a hard conversation shrinking from days down to hours, from hours down to minutes? Is he coming back to repair things faster than he used to, even if the initial instinct to withdraw is still there? That trajectory, that slow widening of his capacity to stay, is often a far more reliable signal of real investment than any single moment on its own, because it shows growth happening specifically in relation to you. This trajectory is worth tracking honestly, almost like keeping a quiet internal record rather than something you announce or make a big deal out of in the moment. Think back to the very first hard conversation you two ever had. Or how long did it take him to re-engage after that one? Now think about a recent one. Was the gap shorter? Was his return warmer, more genuine, less forced than it used to be? Growth in an avoidant partner rarely announces itself directly. It shows up in these comparisons, in the slow shrinking of distance across similar situations over months and sometimes years, and noticing that shrinking distance is often far more meaningful than waiting for him to verbally declare that he has changed. It is also worth noticing what staying does not require from him. It does not require him to suddenly become emotionally articulate, effortlessly finding the perfect words to express exactly how he feels in the middle of a hard conversation. Avoidant people are often genuinely bad at this, not because they do not feel deeply, but because the language of emotional expression was never something they got much practice using safely. Staying might look like silence, punctuated by short, clumsy attempts at explanation. It might look like him saying, "I do not know how to say this right, but I am not going anywhere." It might look like nothing more than his physical presence remaining steady while his words remain limited. None of that clumsiness cancels out the significance of the staying itself. If anything, the awkwardness proves it is real, because a rehearsed, polished response would be far easier to fake than genuine, uncomfortable presence. This is an important distinction, because it is easy to accidentally punish an avoidant partner for their clumsiness, rather than recognizing the underlying effort. If you find yourself frustrated that he does not say the right things during a hard conversation, try shifting your attention momentarily away from his words and toward his presence instead. Is he still there? Is he still trying, even badly? Is he still choosing to remain in an uncomfortable moment rather than escaping it? That underlying choice to remain, however awkwardly executed, is often the actual signal worth paying attention to, separate entirely from how eloquently he manages to express himself while doing it. There is a specific test worth applying here, quietly in your own mind, the next time a hard conversation comes up. Notice not just what he says, but whether he remains in the room physically and emotionally for the duration of it. Does he see the conversation through to some kind of resolution, even an imperfect one, rather than escaping the second it gets uncomfortable? Does he come back to it later if it got cut short, rather than letting it quietly disappear and pretending it never happened? This pattern, tracked honestly over time rather than judged from a single incident, tells you far more about his actual investment in the relationship than anything he could ever say directly. It helps to understand why this particular behavior matters so much more than grand romantic gestures when it comes to avoidant partners specifically. Grand gestures are, in a strange way, often easier for an avoidant person to perform than sustained emotional presence, because a gesture has a clear beginning and end. It requires a burst of effort followed by a return to safety, to distance, to the comfortable emotional register they know how to operate in. Staying present through an uncomfortable, ongoing conversation offers no such exit. It requires continuous tolerance of discomfort with no scripted ending, which is precisely why it demands so much more from someone wired to avoid exactly that kind of open-ended emotional exposure. A single grand gesture proves he is capable of effort. Sustained staying proves he is capable of genuine intimacy, which is a much rarer and much more valuable thing to witness in someone with this attachment style. This also explains why so many people misjudge avoidant partners, mistaking dramatic romantic behavior for real investment while overlooking quieter signs like this one entirely. A partner who showers you with gifts and grand declarations but disappears completely the moment a real conflict arises is often showing you something important, even if it is uncomfortable to admit. The gestures in that case may be easier for them precisely because gestures do not require the harder work of sustained emotional presence. Meanwhile, a partner who offers fewer grand gestures but consistently stays through difficulty, however clumsily, however imperfectly, is often showing you something far more reliable about how they will handle the inevitable hard seasons every long-term relationship eventually faces. Think about the practical implications of this for a moment, especially if you are trying to decide how seriously to take an avoidant partner over the long term. Every relationship, no matter how strong, eventually faces hard seasons, stretches of stress, disagreement, disappointment, and difficulty that cannot always be smoothed over with a nice dinner or a thoughtful gift. What actually determines whether a relationship survives those seasons is rarely the quality of the good moments. It is almost always the quality of how both people handle the hard ones. A partner who can produce beautiful gestures during easy stretches but disappears the moment things get genuinely difficult is showing you exactly how they are likely to handle real adversity down the line. A partner who struggles to produce beautiful gestures but consistently remains present through difficulty is showing you something arguably far more valuable, evidence that they can actually weather hard seasons alongside you rather than only showing up for the easy ones. This is why staying, as unglamorous as it sounds compared to flowers or surprise trips or elaborate declarations of love, deserves to be weighted so heavily when evaluating an avoidant partner's real investment. It is not the flashiest sign of love. It will never trend on social media the way grand romantic gestures do. But it is arguably the single most functional, most predictive sign available, because it directly measures the exact skill that determines whether a relationship can actually survive long term. The ability to stay connected through discomfort rather than only through ease. None of this means an avoidant partner should get a permanent pass on communication, or that you should quietly accept a relationship where growth never happens and you are left doing all the emotional labor indefinitely. Recognizing this specific sign of investment is not the same as excusing a total absence of effort elsewhere. What it does mean is learning to notice real growth when it happens, even in small, imperfect, quiet forms, rather than dismissing it because it does not look like the version of love you may have been taught to expect. Real change in an avoidant partner rarely arrives as a sudden, dramatic transformation. It arrives exactly like this: one uncomfortable conversation at a time, one moment of staying instead of leaving, slowly building into a pattern that over months and years tells you everything you actually need to know. It is also worth being honest about the limits of this sign, because no single behavior should ever be treated as the entire measure of a relationship. Staying through hard conversations matters enormously, but it should exist alongside other basic markers of a healthy partnership: mutual respect, honesty, a willingness to take accountability when he is actually wrong, rather than only staying present while deflecting blame the entire time. Staying in the room is meaningful, but staying in the room while consistently refusing to ever acknowledge fault or while using the conversation to manipulate rather than genuinely connect is a very different thing entirely, and it is worth being able to tell the difference between the two. Genuine staying involves real vulnerability, even if it is clumsy. It is not simply occupying physical space while emotionally checked out or strategically managing the conversation to avoid consequences. It is also worth remembering that this sign works best as a pattern observed over a meaningful stretch of time, not as a verdict issued after a single good conversation. One instance of him staying through a hard moment is encouraging, but it does not erase months of the opposite pattern, just as one instance of him leaving does not necessarily erase months of consistent presence either. Give yourself the time and the honesty to actually track this across enough situations to see a real trend, rather than anchoring your entire assessment of the relationship on whatever happened most recently. So think back through your own relationship for a moment, honestly, without romanticizing anything and without being unfairly harsh either. Has there been a hard conversation where he could have easily left, easily shut down, easily disappeared for days the way avoidant instinct usually demands, but instead he stayed, however imperfectly, however uncomfortably? Has that staying happened more than once, forming even the beginning of a pattern rather than a single isolated exception? If the answer is yes, sit with that for a moment because it means something real is happening beneath the surface, something far more significant than any of the louder, more obvious signs of love you might have been taught to look for instead. Consider also how this sign fits into the broader picture of your relationship's history together. Think about the specific moments that come to mind first when you ask yourself this question. Were they early on, when the relationship was still new and easy, or did they happen during a genuinely difficult stretch, an argument that mattered, a piece of news that shook things up, a season where either of you was struggling? The hardest moments tend to be the most revealing, precisely because they are the moments where the instinct to retreat is strongest and therefore the choice to stay means the most. If you can point to even one or two of these harder moments where he chose presence over escape, treat that memory as genuinely significant data, not a coincidence, and not something to minimize simply because it did not come wrapped in flowers or a perfectly worded declaration of love. This is precisely why the advice in this video's title matters so much. If an avoidant person does this for you consistently over time, even imperfectly, think very carefully before letting them go, because what you are witnessing is not distance. It is someone actively working against their own deepest wiring, specifically for you, in the exact moments most people with this attachment style would have already walked away. That kind of effort, quiet as it is, unglamorous as it is often the clearest, most honest proof of love an avoidant person is capable of offering, and it deserves to be recognized for exactly what it is. If you are sitting here right now recognizing this pattern in your own relationship, let that recognition actually settle for a moment instead of rushing past it the way you might have done with smaller signs before. You do not need grand declarations for this to be real. You do not need constant reassurance or a partner who has completely transformed overnight. Sometimes the most secure, most enduring kind of love is the kind that shows up quietly, imperfectly, one uncomfortable conversation at a time, proving itself through presence rather than promises. This is also worth remembering the next time you feel discouraged by his lack of eloquence, his clumsy attempts at explanation, his imperfect handling of a hard moment. It is easy, especially in a culture saturated with polished romantic ideals, to hold every partner to the standard of effortless emotional fluency, as though love only counts when it comes wrapped in the right words at the right time. Real love, especially from someone who had to relearn how to stay close to another person from scratch, rarely looks like that. It looks like effort. It looks like trying. It looks like someone choosing again and again imperfectly to remain in the room with you rather than retreating to the safety of distance. And that choice, repeated consistently over time, is worth far more than any single perfectly delivered declaration ever could be. Before you go, one last thing. If this video helped you recognize something real in your own relationship, comment the word keeper one more time down below. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need it most, people who might be sitting exactly where you were a few minutes ago, unsure whether quiet staying counts as real love at all. And if you want the next video, the one where I break down exactly how to tell the difference between an avoidant who is slowly healing and one who is simply stringing you along without ever actually growing, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. Because that one goes even deeper than this, walking through the specific signals that separate genuine slow progress from a pattern that quietly never changes no matter how much time passes. Take care of yourself. Trust what real staying actually looks like. And I will see you in the next one.